Hello, welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover. I'm Leslie Ann Murray. Today we have Robert Jones Jr., writer of the book, The Prophet. I am so happy. Okay, a little bit about Robert. Robert Jones Jr. was born and raised in New York City. He received his BFA in creative writing with honors and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Essence, OK Africa, The Feminist Wire, and The Griot. He's the creator of the social justice social media community, Son of Baldwin. The Prophet is his first debut novel. Robert, welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover.
Thank you so much for having me, Leslie Ann.
Okay, Robert, tell us about the novel, The Prophet.
The Prophets. The Prophets is my attempt to correct the record in regard to the presence of what we now know as the Black queer figure. In many of the works that I read, brilliant works, they sort of skipped over this historical necessity, the presence of the Black queer figure. And in my book, The Prophets, I introduced the reader to Samuel and Isaiah, two young enslaved men who are in love on a plantation in Mississippi during the 1800s, and how that love, their relationship, transforms everyone around them, whether fellow enslaved or enslaver. And there's also a thread where our ancestors sort of bring us back to the before time on the African continent, and we meet analogs for Samuel and Isaiah, Kosai and Alewa, and their entire tribe, including their king Akusa, to sort of ensure that the reader understands that Blackness and queerness are not oppositional, that the Black queer figure has always existed and has a place in the human family.
Thank you for saying that. And also thank you for correcting me. I said The Prophet. You know, Black folks like to shorten people.
Either add S's or take S's away.
Exactly. You mentioned the importance of presenting Blackness and queerness, and it's not oppositional. Why is that an important? Why is that important? I know why, but tell us why.
Well, you know, it's timely, this question, when we're looking at the conversations that are taking place around Dave Chappelle and his repeated conversations around trans people, and the way in which his conversations sort of separate Black people from the idea of transness and queerness, as though Black trans and Black queer people don't exist. He frames it as solely the purview of whiteness, which is a misunderstanding that many people in Black communities hold. There's this belief that the only reason why Black people are queer or trans is because slavery was such a traumatic experience that it moved them or shifted us from our natural state of heterosexuality and cisgenderness. But that is false.
In a recent interview about your novel, you said that the main characters in your book, Samuel and Isaiah, needed witnesses, and hence you came up with the book title, The Prophet. Can you talk more about that idea?
Sure. When I first started what would become The Prophets, I was actually going to tell it from one person's point of view. It was going to be told only from Isaiah's point of view. And at the time, I had named him Hannibal, and the title of the book was Sing Hannibal, Bear Witness. And it was going to be a sort of fictional slave narrative where Isaiah is telling this story about his life on this plantation and the great love of his life and such. But then I realized that Isaiah's point of view was a little bit too limited for the scope of what I wanted to capture. And so I said, well, I'll give his partner, Samuel, a voice, and it'll be like the two of them speaking to each other, and realized that too was too limiting. And quickly came to understand that what was really at the heart of this was their love. And that love, in order to be seen, heard, understood, felt, needed other people to testify to it. Even if that testimony was wicked or negative, it needed to be testified so that we know. That is when I decided to bring in the other points of view, as well as the voices of the ancestors and some of our ancestors from the before time, to give a full account of this love and its place in existence.
Yeah. I think that's really important. And when reading the work, I think about how, like, when I was in undergrad, my undergrad professor once said, Black love is revolutionary. And when I was reading the prophets, I thought about how revolutionary that Isaiah and Samuel's love is. And it made them shine, right? It was so beautiful, it made them shine. And I was like, if people would have just like accepted their love, they could have been impacted by that shining, right? Because they were so authentic within themselves and within their love. And I love that you were able to convey that.
Love is probably the most transformative force that humankind has ever known. And because of that, it is also, for many of us, the most terrifying force. We feel much more in control when it's something violent or hateful. Love makes us too vulnerable, and we're terrified of vulnerability. And so we praise our destroyers. And that is one of the tragic conundrums of being a human being, is that love is going to save us, but we're always running toward destruction.
So in the past year, there have been many Black writers, Deisha Philya, Monica West, really critiquing the Black church and how Christianity has such a parochial view on gender and sexuality. And this is so different from the books we have seen in the past. What is this new wave about?
I think Black people are tired. Um, and the more tired we are, paradoxically, the more we know. And I think we're at a point in history where we know a lot about the ways in which we became Christian, for example, through antebellum slavery, the ways in which many Christian practices replicate the structures of our oppressors. We are becoming more in touch with ancestral knowledges, in which we understand that these things that we thought were fixed in nature, like race and gender and sexuality and gender identity and such, are not fixed. That the Western way of thinking of these things is just one of many ways of thinking of them, and it's not scientific, quote unquote. And then we now begin to question these things that we used to take as a given. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on a loop of how Jesus is letting us suffer, and that suffering is unbearable. And so we must find other ways to halt the suffering, to liberate ourselves, to love ourselves even, such that we don't tolerate unnecessary pain and unnecessary oppression that is heaped upon us by others.
So your novel is intersecting history with fiction to map out a path for Black folks, because so much of our history has been erased by violence and colonization and slavery. Why was this mapping important?
I'm writing in a tradition, the same tradition that Toni Morrison was writing in, where she said, I leave to the sociologist to talk about how it should be. I, as a literary artist, want to talk about how it was so that we never forget. And so a lot of what fascinates me about writing is excavating parts of the past that were either buried or glossed over or ignored or intentionally erased as a way to understand our present and why we're in the predicaments that we're in. And so that is why it is so important for me to cover these topics, to talk about these things, to delve into these histories, to give voice to those who whose voices were silenced.
Yeah, and I think this is why I really like the voices, the different voices in the work, because it's just giving this multitude of perspective that you wouldn't even imagine, right? And yeah, I understand, like if it was just in Isaiah's point of view, we would miss so much. And I think with the voices, it just broadens a perspective for us of like a slave plantation, right? And what are the enslaved really thinking, feeling from day to day? I think when we're imagining the enslaved, it's especially, I think in movies and in different ways, it's really hard to imagine, first of all. But when we do it, it's very like caricatures, right? People are just working and there's no identity, there's no sexualities, there's nothing happening. And I think with your book, you're just broadening out these things to say these people exist in real bodies. They were forced into slavery, you know, they had to do this, but they had these other things happening to them. And I just really like that.
I credit Toni Morrison for helping me to understand the interiority of our ancestors who survived or who were killed during that period. So for me, slavery is the background. The foreground is are these characters, the love between them, the fraught relationships between them. They were people. And like you said, we often forget that. We think of them as slaves. And that is why I no longer use that term to describe them. I call them enslaved because it was something that was done to them. It wasn't something that they were. You know, a slave is a non-thing. My ancestors were people and who were dehumanized, yes, but never lost their humanity. Whose humanity was up for question were the enslavers. That's whose humanity was in question because of the horrific acts they committed. So I wanted to make sure that when I told this story, their humanity was front and center.
Robert Jones Jr. of The Prophets, writer of the novel The Prophets. I'm saying my S's. Thank you for joining A Brown Girl Book Lover. Thank you for giving us a lot of beauty. Thank you for talking about love, which is like the most important thing. And thank you for just, you know, giving us something different to read and think about. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a joy.